Hi, I'm Seamless, and today I've enabled exclusive window capture, or disabled it, which lets us see floating objects like this and other menus. So yay! Today is Friday, which means it's time for a new how to base tutorial, and today I'm going to show you how to make this sound. Just a second. Before we move on, I want to tell you that this is labeled how to base 148, but it's actually how to base 145. You might notice that I already have a how to base 145, but hilariously, this one was made before that one. This was when I was still in the throng of having throng of having the copyright strike, and I couldn't upload videos longer than 10 minutes, and I forgot about that when I made the video, and it was longer than 10 minutes. And so I uploaded it onto Facebook instead, and I was going to put it online once I had, the thing undone. And so that was neat, except that I forgot not to call the next how to base 145, because when I checked what number it was, I checked the YouTube videos, and there was just 144 there, and 145 was up on Facebook. And so I continued on the series, and there was like 4 more of them since then. So that makes this 100, or 3 more, I suppose. And that makes this one how to base 148. Now, that's why I'm putting it up today and not on this week's Friday, because there's going to be a real how to base this week. I just realized while I was like, wait a minute, I could have sworn this was not the same one, and I was right, because it's not. But just putting that there. Anyway, yes, onward with the regular how to base. All kinds of good stuff. So this is actually a sound that I've done in one or different ways, just a whole bunch of different times. However, a lot about how I made this is pretty different, and it can be applied to a whole bunch of other stuff. I did feel a little nostalgic and decided that I haven't done a real vocoder bass lately that actually used an actual carrier, like just for real audio, as opposed to some strange like Harmer version or just using a synth on its own to be its own modulator, that kind of thing. I've done a lot of that, but I haven't done actual vocoding, which involves using a vocal. And today I am. Anyway, the coolness of this has to do with mostly this guy. This is the wave shaper that's on the carrier, is doing a lot of strange stuff in asymmetrical land. This is sort of what I refer to as asymmetrical distortion, and we'll get involved with that. Not a single thing is happening to the modulator. And then there's actually a lot of pretty deep stuff that I'm doing with Vocodex, mostly involving the band distribution window, which does fun stuff. And then I'm also automating a whole bunch of things, which is in line with how I used to do a lot of my Vocodex bases. If you ever looked at the Menagerie project file inside FL, you'll see that there's just I have 8 automation clips for any one of the vocoder sounds, because I'm just automating a lot of the primary parameters plus a lot of FM, that kind of thing. There's not really as many happening here, but I am automating quite a bit of stuff. So it'll be pretty sweet. Let's begin at the beginning, which involves the carrier. We're actually going to work at this backwards, so we can explain sort of the top down to the bottom of the effect, because a lot of the changes, this is kind of one of these sounds, a lot of the changes that I make to the sound, I did with all the effects kind of on top, and that kind of thing. Up front, we have Maximus. This is just compressing things together. Honestly, it's not even really multibanding. It's just full on, just crunching it together. And then there's this wave shaper. And the reason the Maximus exists is because there's a high pass filter here. When it gets pretty high up there, it actually gets very, very quiet. So the compression needs to be there to kind of bring it back up, even though it's being distorted to death with the wave shaper. Now, this is going to require some visual aids. This is actually why I have this here. But I'm going to need to actually do this again with another guy, just to explain what the hell I mean when I say asymmetrical distortion. I talked about just regular asymmetrical distortion, but it's fine to kind of do a refresher, because a lot of people are kind of unclear about what the wave shaper does at all, let alone all the extra stuff we can do with things like asymmetricalness. I need wave candy. I pretty much never use this for anything. Where is it? Oh, it's up here. Okay. Sorry, my monitor is way too high resolution. If you're wondering if 4K is reasonable, I'm here to tell you it's not. All right, let's update. That's weird. I don't see the. I'm supposed to be able to right click this, and it should tell us. Oh, because I'm so let's go. Derp. Okay. Neat. So I'm gonna get this. So right now I'm running a triangle wave through the wave shaper, and the reason I'm using a triangle wave is because it's pretty much a one-to-one shot of what's happening with the line here. The way that wave shaping works is that when we look at a waveform like this, we have the center line here, which is the zero crossing. The zero crossing is represented by the bottom of the waveform here. This zero crossing, when the waveform begins, it goes up, and it comes back down, and oscillates back and forth. Hence an oscillation, hence an oscillator, why everything refers to as that. This is a measurement in amplitude of the signal. This amplitude is being pushed out, which is the position of the speaker, which moves air, and that's how we hear things. This is all happening very, very fast, of course. But the purpose of looking at this is that you can kind of look at this as being some kind of volume automation, and of just volume. And this is important because this volume automation is being pushed through this curve here. So if I play notes and move the curve around, you see it doing things. You can up the gain a bit. Now, that may have been a bit difficult to sort of just tell what's happening immediately, but if I do something very specific, like this. Hopefully this makes a bit more sense. So remember we said that this here is the zero crossing. So when the line is going up, and it's going up normal. When this line is like this, you see it is input versus output. When a line is just straightforward, this is essentially a 1-to-1 ratio. No change is happening. You might have thought to yourself, oh, like compressors. Actually, yes, exactly like compressors. This process is identical to what a compressor does. It just doesn't have time variables. So it happens immediately. It happens so fast that it alters the shape of the waveform as such. So then when it gets to a certain amplitude, it gets pushed through the line here. You can see now it's being pushed down. As it gets pushed through more amplitude, it gets pushed through more of this line. So then as it gets louder and louder, this gets pushed back up again, and then it comes up. And then it hits its peak, and then it comes back down. And on its way back down, it gets pushed through the thing again. So now you see here, even though we have one little thing here, it shows up 4 times per oscillation. It's showing up once when it goes up, once when it goes down, and then once when it goes up and down again in the negative. Because there's a positive and a negative amplitude that goes above and below the zero crossing. So this is where asymmetrical distortion comes into play. Asymmetrical distortion in this sense is where we have the setting, this little button here, it turns it on to bipolar mode. This little setting here, you can see now this is actually the curve that we set up before. Now, instead of this representing the whole in and out, now these little quadrants represent in and out. And the center here is 0 and zero crossing. And then this is max negative and max positive. And right now, let's set up to still do the same thing. But we can do something like this. Where we are now able to affect the wave shaping for the positive and the negative amplitude independently. This is asymmetrical distortion. However, this grid and this graph that we're presented with is we're still able to manipulate it the same way that we did when it wasn't in asymmetrical mode. Which does a whole lot of weird stuff. And this is where what I refer to as asymmetrical comes into play. That's not what I want to do. None of that's what I want to do. All right. Asymmetrical is what I would call it when you take a negative amplitude position and you push it up so hard that it actually goes into the positive amplitude. Because you can do that. I've actually done this before, like without really thinking about it, and I've paid much attention to it. But the reason I actually thought about doing this for How to Bass recently, is because I was looking at the hardstyle track from scratch, and I actually made a minor change to the kick in that song, which was done with asymmetrical distortion, and I moved the positive amplitude over a bit, like so. And this accomplished very strange things. So this is how you're able to essentially just do really wacky wave shaping business with asymmetrical distortion. And this is what I'm doing. Don't need that anymore. On this guy. I turned you off, didn't I? That's a... By the way, what's going on in the Citrus is that this is a saw wave that I changed into component harmonics and then randomized phases, but then also brought back certain phases to kind of maintain some sharpness, but also maintain some not sharpness. This is going through the wave shaper. Now this wave shaper, now that we know that we're in asymmetrical mode, we can look at this and we can see that, okay, so this is being brought up and this is brought down below into the negative polarity, and this is being brought up into the positive polarity, and then I have the pulse type line type, which is doing this business in the positive amplitude of the negative area. So it's bringing the negative up into the positive, doing this kind of weirdness to it. And this is causing a very strange shape to show up. That movement we're seeing is a result of aliasing in a lot of places, not just in the wave shaper, but also in the Citrus, even though the note itself is static. It's because of the phase change of the harmonics that are interacting with each other at such high levels that are causing minor phase cancellation, which is being interpreted once being shoved through this ridiculous shape as being a vague Reesing effect. I put the high pass before the wave shaper. Now, I mentioned earlier that you can think of this whole thing as being like a venue for volume automation. This is essentially volume automation. That's just happening at the oscillation level. This alters the volume of the input. It also alters the phase while you're moving it. You might have noticed when you're messing with any kind of filtering that rubbing the filter around a harmonic like that seems to alter the position of the harmonic. And this is this is phase modulation is what this is. And what happens is that in order for an EQ to do its job, my personal favorite visualization of this is actually in the plugin Serum, where if we look at any given filter, in order to accomplish its job, what it's doing is that it's altering the phase of frequencies around the position of the cutoff frequency. This creates the attenuation, if it's attenuating it, or the interference, which is causing it to boost of those particular frequencies in that particular position. The term phase distortion has to do with when that goes too far, and there's all to do with that, but that's not what's happening here. What's happening is that if you alter the phase of a sound while you're playing it, it is altering its position as it gets put out. It's the starting phase, which will it'll squish or elongate the waveform, otherwise change its pitch. Otherwise known as changing its pitch. So this is actually how digital FM works. The actual act of FM in a digital plugin is done, or piece of hardware is done through phase modulation. And when you do it with a filter, it's the same thing. So moving this filter not only changes the volume, but it also changes the pitch, which creates phase interference, which is causing phase cancellation, which causes attenuation of volume, which changes how this automation is being applied to the waveform, which explains a lot about what we're going to show you when we get to the main automation of the actual vocoding when this happens, when this goes into play. So that's a lot of information to sort of describe why this is happening. Let's move on to what's happening in the Vocodex. Let's turn off all the other stuff. So this guy is the high-pass filter from the carrier. This is the bandwidth, and this is the modulator pitch of Vocodex itself. Now, I'm automating the bandwidth, and I'm using 100 bands, which I almost never use when I'm using Vocodex. And that's because what that usually does is that it makes everything sound way too, clear. You can hear, every little inflection without even really trying too hard of the modulator, which is not super commonly what you want to get out of this type of sound. However, if you look at what's happening down there, it doesn't really look like what it looks like when there's 100 bands. In fact, what it looks like when there's 100 bands is that. That is very much not that. So what's up with that? Well, that has everything to do with the bandwidth, or the band distribution graph, and a little bit with the modulator pitch shift. So the band distribution graph, if you ever looked at this or messed with this, makes a lot of things seem somewhat unpredictable. What this does is that it distributes sort of where the bands are weighted. But by default, I bring it back the dummy Vocodex. By default, is this set up correctly? That's really about it sounding too perfect. So by default, the way that the distribution is set up is this position here. And what this is telling us is essentially what frequencies are the bands able to be in position to. Now this is a bit difficult to grasp because there's a graph, there's a EQ graph here, but that's not what's happening in this graph. The EQ is actually vertical. If you mouse over this and you look at the information tab, you can see that the frequencies are corresponding to the vertical position. And what this is essentially saying is that the bands are being stuck from this graph, positioned from this position, which is at 82 hertz up to the max hertz. So it's saying it's not in the sub-bass level. And we can make it in the sub-bass level. And we can see some starting to show up down there. If you ever wondered why there was never any bass in the Vocodex. We could also push it really hard. As you see here, I've essentially shoved all 100 bands to only fit up here. We could, of course, make that do something different as well. That's what the band distribution thing does. And if you start to curve it around, it does some even weirder things. You can see that it's essentially distributing it in uneven amount. It's not linearly positioned anymore. We could do the opposite as well. This is how we're able to use the 100 bands to our advantage by essentially saying that we can change the band density in different positions. It's not necessarily like what the band width does. It's more like the band density. And in the main actual Vocodex here, I have controlled this to be somewhat slight. So when you look at this, you can sort of think about this in a couple of ways. You can think of this as being like when we position it to be a horizontally flat line, we're forcing the bands that would be in those positions to exist in a very small frequency range. So this is 812 hertz to 2600 hertz versus what would not be necessarily that much. This is almost a linear progression, almost. And we're looking at something like this. We're looking at this and we're saying that we're fitting a number of, like, only a very few number of bands into a larger position of harmonics. Like, the difference between the two ideas are apparent if we mess with it here. So if I did a very vertical position like this, we're saying that, like, only these are a small amount of bands are here. A very many, like, large number of bands are up here and down here. And if I did, of course, the opposite, what would that look like? Like this, I suppose. It's down there now. Yeah, so it gets, it's just, anyway, but those bands, by the way, are still being read. Those are still, like, the original information that are being read in those positions elsewhere, I think. And if they're not, actually, I guess they're not. They're still in the position that they would be. They're just differently located. It's almost like if you were to go to the band gain or the band bandwidth positioned and do crap like that. But the bands themselves actually change. And this is actually super duper important because one of the things that happens when you mess around with Vocodex, vocoding in general, is that the act of splitting up the bands at all causes very particular and very, like, noticeably similar like phasing almost. It looks like a phaser if you look at in the spectrum. It has the same kind of, like, very sharp levels, shows up evenly distributed in the spectrum, and that sounds very noticeable, familiar. Sounds very familiar when you hear that. You can identify that as being, oh, that's vocoding, or it's phasing, one or the other. I've mistaken a lot of phaser antics for vocoding in the past. I'm also screwing around with the modulated pitch shift. I just did stuff, honestly, until it sounded good. I wasn't really paying attention to what was happening here. I was mostly focusing on experimenting with the band distribution thing, because that's actually really cool. And then I'm also modulating the actual pitch modulation, which there's an option here for it to follow or is that only for the other guys? Yeah, it's for the other guys. So this guy doesn't actually do that, but he automated and moves around through it. I'm also automating the main bandwidth. Now, the bandwidth modulation is interesting because there's actually two very distinct profiles that you get when you're using the bandwidth. Well, I guess three. There's a reasonable middle ground. There's a very sort of too thick high ground, and then there's a really glassy low ground. So if I went the really glassy low ground, like that sound, and especially because I'm using 100 bands, albeit distributed in very strange ways, this has a tremendous effect. Now, that's a bit too much to use in a constant way, but if we use that, like if every so often we go down there and we get like this tinge of strange phaseness, it adds to sort of the modulation complexity, and we don't hear it long enough for us to be like, ugh, glassy, pitchy weirdness. And here's the modulated pitch shift, just doing that kind of thing. And now let's talk about the importance of the high pass. So not just because it creates a particular, feel, but strangely, when I go low with it, it gets particularly thick. Like that. Now that is 100% the result of what we were talking about with the wave shaper. When we go lower and we move around those harmonics, it creates the phase modulation, which causes the pitch to change, which causes phase cancellation, which causes volume changing, which causes strange alterations in the wave shaping parameters, which come out across as strange as like that. However, if we make it so that it's a bit more static, you can hear that it actually becomes like a solid sound. But if it's moving, we get that pitch weirdness. So if we're using this automation, we want to be careful about where we're automating. And once we get high enough, though, it keeps that kind of sharpness. It isn't much of an issue anymore. There's, of course, a too high for that kind of thing. Now, this area is a sound that people like to get a lot. And the thing that's doing that is just that we're going to a low note. We're already pretty low because I'm using C as a root note, which is lower than a lot of people would go for typically the usage of this kind of sound. It's just that we're using a low note that's causing this effect. That kind of low rumbly effect is really just because it's low. Although it's very important that in the carrier, when we go that low, that there's still a lot of high frequency content. You can kind of see how when it goes down there, that the high frequency content just drops out. And that's because we're using the harmonic version of the saw wave as opposed to an actual saw wave. And what that means is that there is actually a limit to what the highest frequency it can generate, not unlike Harmer's limit. And so when it goes down, there's really not a lot going on to higher frequencies. However, because of the ridiculous wave shaping, like what comes out of there, you can see the measurement up top there. What comes out of that is just an incredible amount of high frequency all the time, which is very important for when we're vocoding stuff, because we need to have that source of high frequency content for there to be high frequency vocoding. Because if the carrier didn't have the high frequency content, it didn't matter that the voice had the high frequency content, there wouldn't be anything there for the bands to act on. It would sound strangely low passed if we didn't do that. In the past, I accomplished this with FM to similar effect of just making sure that there's always high frequency content. But wacky wave shaping is a totally another way to do that. So then the other thing that's happening out here is I had this flanger on. This is just here to kind of give some extra weird stuff to it. Like I initially wanted it as a static effect, but it wasn't doing it. So then I'm using this kind of like a fill sound. Every once in a while it kind of just shows up and spends most of the time being not all that forward. I put this here because I thought I was going to have to EQ it, but no, not really. The gross beat is that kind of noisy effect thing I do, where this line looks like it's flat, but it's actually a super duper small change here, and then a little bit of tension on it, so that the time is slowly bringing the pitch down, and then I'm doing half time change and half regular. And we get that phase cancellation sound. This repeats every 4 bars. But yeah, so I think it feels nice. And then Maximus. And then Carrier back up. This is basically just low, mid, high, eliminating to make sure that everything's all nice and leveled and high and huge, and we know your average over the top compression. But it should be noted that there's no separate sub to this, and also that the sub is wildly unreliable in this because of the high passing and the ridiculous wave shaping. So if you were going to have this in a track, you would absolutely need to high pass this and replace the low end with something more manageable. So as far as like automation choices go, there's not a lot of coordination going on. The pitch motion also matters quite a bit. Especially in the beginning. Like the high passing against it. It going up as it goes down, that kind of thing, and starting up, that sort of thing. Just moving with it, like that's that kind of deal. And also that the pitch itself is moving with it. You know, the bandwidth, all that stuff. Just a lot of some motion is synced together, and a lot of other motion is just kind of doing stuff. And I don't really think too hard about explaining a lot of what's happening here because I didn't think a lot about it when I was just doing it. It just kind of happened. And you can tell when things get a little too hairy, like if you bring the bandwidth down too far, like that happens. And you're just like, oh. Only a little bit. I just love that. Oh, God. Oh, there was one funny thing I did when I was trying to ring modulate it, just for fun. But if you ring modulate it, it suddenly kind of cuts out a bit. It's a little bit odd. And if you get it slightly off time, a little bit faster, maybe. I thought that was kind of funny. Like, that wasn't something I worked out, but I just wanted to let you know that happens. The strangeness of it not really working out like that has to do with how it gets interpreted by the wave shaping, which causes it to freak out. Yeah. All the good stuff. I wasn't really expecting the behavior of the high pass beneath this as well, like in combo with the bandwidth. The real kind of winner about this, there's really two things that matter about this particular video. This is the asymmetrical wave shaping and the band distribution inside Vocodex. That stuff, that is a good way of making Vocodex sound particularly unique, because you're essentially changing like the position of the vocoding angle. And if you ever thought that, oh, that sounds too vocoding or too specifically like Vocodex, it's because the bands are always evenly distributed. And if you change that even distribution, you get different profile. And do that different enough, and it might even align with what you're doing to the point where it won't sound like it's being vocoded. Or maybe it would, but it'll sound different. Which, don't we all want to sound different? Except when we don't. Anyway, pretty sure I recorded this properly this time. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all that good stuff. I have a Patreon. You should look at it. And as usual, have a nice day.